The place to look at the nature of American democracy, the obvious place to look, is in the Constitutional Convention. The debates on the Constitutional Convention, which laid out the framework of what became American democracy, and they're interesting. They're not much read. What people usually read is the Federalist Papers. I'm sure you've read those. But the Federalist Papers are a misleading source. The Federalist Papers were propaganda, remember. They were written in order to convince the public, who didn't like what was happening much, to convince them to accept the new constitutional system. So when you read the Federalist Papers, you're reading a kind of a watered-down version, a prettified version of the thinking that was going on. In the debates on the Constitutional Convention, it's much clearer. And they're interesting. The main framer, as you know, was James Madison, who was at the sort of libertarian end and a very intelligent and lucid analyst and exponent of his views, and his views largely prevailed. I mean, there was very little opposition to them at the end. He was quite clear on what he was doing. The model that everyone had in mind, of course, is England. That was the most democratic existing society of the day, so they were sort of, and the one, their mother country. So they're asking, well, what about the British parliamentary system? And there were debates about whether to accept it or modify it or whatever. Madison pointed out that the British system would have problems if they transferred it over here, and that is because the United States, they did want to make it, he and the other founding fathers, as they're called, did want to make it a more participatory and democratic society. But he said a democratic society has a serious flaw. The flaw is that in a democratic society the people can participate. And he said, suppose this were to take place in England. Suppose, for example, in England, that they really allowed people to vote, which they didn't. He said, well, the first thing people would do would be to call for what we nowadays call agrarian reform. That is, they would call for changes in the land laws, which would grant more people access to the highly privatized and centralized land system. And that, land was a crucial part of the economy then. And he says, well, we obviously can't accept that. We don't want to have any system that will allow people to participate and infringe on the rights of private property and wealth. So therefore we have to be careful not to allow a democratic system in which things really function democratically. We have to design a system in which power is in the hands of the wealth of the nation, quoting, the more capable set of men, those who are sympathetic with the rights of property. Okay, they must have the power, and the rest must be dispersed and factionalized in such a way that they don't really interfere with the rights of power. Actually, Madison, who was no fool, recognized that this problem was going to become greater as time went on. As he put it, if I can read my own notes, he said there's going to be an increase in the proportion of the population that labors under all the hardships of life and secretly sighs for a more equal distribution of its blessings. Okay, there's going to be an increase in that, and if those people really have an ability to participate, they're going to do things which will infringe on the right of private power and private property on the wealthy, and therefore we have to design the system so that doesn't happen. And indeed the system was designed so that that wouldn't happen. That was the role of the Senate, was to represent the wealth of the nation, and the role of the separation of powers and so on and so forth. How will it function? You can argue. It's an interesting question, but it's worth noticing that this idea about the nature of democracy has a this problem in the nature of democracy, that namely if people can vote, they're going to vote in their own interests and infringe on the rights of private power and wealth. That insight goes way back. It goes back to the origins of political theory. So you read the first major book on political theory in something like our sense, Aristotle's Politics. That's a core question of Aristotle's politics. Aristotle distinguishes tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy, and has a long, elaborate discussion of each, and favors democracy. He didn't think it was perfect, but he favored democracy as the best system. For him, a democracy was very straightforward. It meant a community of equals. or to be precise, free men who are equals. And that phrase, free men, is rather crucial, but put that aside for a moment. A community of free men who are equal and participatory. Unless it's equal, and they can't be seriously participatory, he noticed the same problem that Madison did. Exactly the same problem. He said, suppose that you did have a democracy where everyone participated, but you had radical inequality, so concentration of wealth. He said, well, then the poorer part of the population, which is the majority, will use their voting power for their own interests, to advance their own interests, instead of the common good of all. Okay? And the goal of a democracy for Aristotle was to advance the common good of all. But if you had inequality, radical inequality, well, yeah, the majority of the population would vote for their own interests, which would not be the common good of all. So therefore, he had to do something about that. It's the same problem that Madison faced, exactly the same problem, but they reached opposite conclusions. Madison's conclusion was that we should reduce democracy so that you don't get the threat from the population. Aristotle's was the opposite. You should reduce inequality. So therefore the problem won't arise, and you could have a real participatory democratic system. So Aristotle called for what we today would call a welfare state. He said that a democracy must be based on use of public revenues to ensure lasting prosperity for everyone. Welfare state, in other words. And then he describes in some detail how you could proceed to do that in Athens. Do it differently here, but the same kinds of questions. And then if everyone had moderate but sufficient income, you wouldn't have this problem that both he and Madison faced. But notice that their choices were radically different. One choice was to aim for equality and participation in democracy. The other, the one on which our country was founded, was to reduce the threat of democracy, maintain the inequality, and ensure that power remains in the Senate, the capable class of men, the wealthy part of the wealthy part of the society. That's now internationalized. So this huge financial capital that's flowing around the world is sometimes called by international economists a virtual Senate, meaning it has the power to ensure, if you really liberalize capital, to ensure that no country will be able to undertake social policies that strike at the interests of the wealthy. Because if any country moves in that direction, the capital quickly flows out of it and the country goes down the tube. So it's a virtual Senate, kind of a generalization of Madison's Senate. And the opposite of the Aristotelian conception of democracy is necessarily based on a welfare state and equality.